All right, some final thoughts about about giving, the topic that has been the topic of this chapter thus far. A few things I didn't get in last week. God blesses the giver proportionate to their giving. I think I might have got into that, where 2 Corinthians 9:6 says, "But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall also reap also bountifully." Luke 6:38, "Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down and shaken together and running over, shall men give into your bosom. For with the same measure that you mete, withal it shall be measured to you again." I think I mentioned the fact that, God, you can't outgive God, but don't make the mistake of believing that God's always going to give you back exactly what you spent monetarily. God's always going to bless you back in some way, but the prosperity gospel people, they want to tell you, hey, whatever you put in the collection plate, you're going to get that back sevenfold. Well, they imply then that God's always going to pay you back with money. That's not necessarily true, and nor should that be our motive to give. God is very much offended when we fail to give. Malachi chapter 3, verse 8, even though this is an Old Testament passage, it still rings true today, where Malachi said, "Will a man rob God? Yet," this is, of course, God speaking through his prophet Malachi, "Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. But ye say, wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings." And so we no longer tithe, obviously, but can we rob God today by not offering back to him anything after all the blessings he's given us? Another Old Testament statement that's applicable for us today, Haggai 1, 4 through 7. God speaking through Haggai said, "It is time for you, O ye," or "Is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses?" Another translation for that would be paneled, or the idea is comfortable, lavish houses. "And this house," speaking of the temple, "lie waste. Now therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. You have sown much and bring in little. Ye eat, but you have not enough. You drink, but you are not filled with drink. Ye clothe you, but there is none warm. And he that earneth wages to put it into a bag with holes. Thus saith the Lord, consider your ways." And so the problem that the prophet is identifying here is the people, they felt like they didn't have anything to give come time to give to the Lord, but they were living in nice, lavish houses. And it was as if they were putting money, they were wasteful. They were not being frugal with their spending. It was like they were putting their money into a bag with holes in it. And so certainly a message for us to consider: do we live in nice houses? I know we all do. Do we have all the comforts that money can buy? And I know that we do. And we often probably throw away our money on entertainment things and newest fashion trends and various gadgets, vehicles, and vacations. But let us not make the mistake, if we do that, on the day that we come into the assembly, all of a sudden to get frugal. I've been in business meetings before in congregations that, when it came to doing fun things and paying for this and that, we had the money. But when it came to something that wasn't so desirable, all of a sudden, we couldn't find the money anymore. And so these are things for us to think on. I want to end this section on the collection for the saints by reading a statement. This was in MacArthur's commentary, and I think it's quite interesting to hear. It regards Christians' care for one another in difficult times, and MacArthur is quoting Aristides, who he says was an Athenian statesman, and he's describing Christians and their practices of giving. And I think this ought to make us all thankful to be Christians, and these are honorable words. He said, quote, "They walk in humility and kindness, and falsehood is not found among them. They love one another. They despise not the widow, and they grieve not the orphan. He that hath distributed liberally to him that hath, he that hath distributeth, excuse me, can't get that out, and tongue tied up today. He that hath distributeth liberally to him that hath not. If they see a stranger, they bring him in under their roof, and they rejoice over him as if he were their brother. For they call themselves brethren, not after the flesh, but after the Spirit, and in God. But when one of their poor passes from the world, and any of them see him, then he provides for his burial according to his ability. And if they hear that any of their number is in prison or oppressed for the name of their Messiah, all of them provide for his needs. And if it is possible that he may be delivered, they deliver him. And if there is among them a man that is poor and needy, and they have an abundance of necessity, they have not an abundance of necessity, they will fast 2 or 3 days that they may supply the needy with his necessary food." End quote. What a beautiful picture. And that wasn't written by someone who was a Christian. That was an outsider observing the behavior of Christians. How beautiful. I hope that we still have that attitude today. I know that based on the reading there, I think we still have some room to grow. All right, any questions or comments about giving that we haven't covered? Brother Phil.
I know we discussed tithing a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly when we watch these shows on TV and stuff, that term is emphasized a lot. But when you go back and study the Old Testament tithing, that was the baseline. That was the minimum.
Mm-hmm.
That was meant to give. That does not mean that they couldn't give way more. I've heard it said that we should be probably thankful if we didn't live through those times, because most people today probably don't give anywhere near 10% of what they make. And so if we lived during that time, we would be hurting a lot more than we are now. We're not commanded to give any percentage.
Mm-hmm.
That was the minimum that they would give. That's
Right.
That was not the cap, or that was, you figured it was going to be 10%, and it was also 10% of basically everything that they had, not 10% of their yearly wages.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that we should always consider
Certainly.
our own giving.
Certainly kind of a benchmark if one was to be thinking, well, I just don't even know where to begin to think about how much I should give. And it's interesting, when floods come, occasionally that water level will come up real high, and you can tell by looking at the trees around some of these riverways, you can kind of see a mark on those trees and say, you know what, the water level can come up that high. It's a benchmark. And so, this is somewhat of a benchmark. It gives us an idea where to start. I've heard that it's estimated that the Jew actually gave closer to 30% of their income when you consider the tithing, the free will offerings that they were to give above and beyond the tithe, and then the offerings and sacrifices that they also give in certain festivals and times of sacrifice for sins and such. It's estimated that it was closer to 30%. Of course, I think that under the Old Testament, another thing perhaps to consider, if we want to be fair on that, is I think Israel was considered to be was envisioned to be a theocracy, and so some of that probably was considered would have been maybe like taxes for the running of the government as well. If we want to be fair, I think that's probably the case. But at any rate, in the New Testament, we're not given a specific amount. But I think I've always thought that, agreed with the precept that 10% is a good place to start. Some people say give till it hurts, and then give just a little bit more. Have you ever heard that, Phil? That's something somebody in my family used used to tell me, my father-in-law, he's an elder, and he was an elder for a long time, and he said, give until it hurts, and then give just a little bit more. Yes, sir. Well, I know that they should have been, but knowing what the picture that we have of the scribes and the Pharisees, religious rulers in the scriptures, I think they probably, if they wanted to, they probably could have easily justified themselves, rationalized not giving themselves. Perhaps that was the case. Any other questions or comments?
This is a Johnny Ramsey quote,
Okay.
And I cannot remember the verse, but there's a verse in here that implies, something like what you just said, give until it hurts. He said that the true interpretation of this verse, and I'm trying to look now to try to see if I can figure out what the verse is, but it implies, give till it hurts, but it really means give till you reach a point where you're laughing out loud. In other words, you've gone past the point of hurt, so now you're just
You done gone crazy.
you're just overjoyed with
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
ability to help the Lord in His work, and so much so that you're just laughing out loud with joy over your ability to be a teammate with Him.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
I'm changing subjects on you a little
Okay.
bit relating to this. So we've always understood from Old Testament that giving back to God in the various ways, whether offerings or sacrifices and so forth, were all worship. And so the Bible clearly indicates giving back to the Lord is worship. This is a key verse in identifying that it's a worship activity of the first day of the week. That's what it is. And he gives a practical application or a reason for doing it, so that you don't have to go and collect large sums at other times as needs arise and so forth. So we have deduced from the scripture that it's a form of worship to give every week. You should do it on the first day of the week. Not that you couldn't give other times. And that's been a lot of our interpretation of this in our new society where things like automatic deduction and online payment processes or recurring payment. I've been asked that question before. Could I just set up a recurring payment and just have that as my contribution? And then somebody would come back to me. I've asked this question. I get paid in a very infrequent manner, and so I've been giving as I prosper.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get paid every week. In fact, I imagine very few people get paid every week. And so some have said, can I pay first Sunday after payday? And so I've kind of interpreted this. There's a great practicality that's been put into this verse. So that, and then when we get to 2 Corinthians, when they haven't been doing it,
Mm-hmm.
and Paul chastises them about the displeasure and shame that will be on them when he comes and they haven't been doing it. They're not prepared to participate. But anyway, rambling here a little bit.
No, that's fine.
But I've been asked that question about frequency, this Bible requirement that says you got to do it the first day of the week. It's part of worship. What if I don't do it every Sunday? And I've guided people with that question because there seems to be conflicting as you prosper and as first day of the week
Right.
in a planning fashion.
Mm-hmm.
So I've encouraged, well, if you're comfortable doing it as you prosper,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that that's part of it. But if you feel uncomfortable about not participating, you can do both.
Mm-hmm.
When the plate comes by, you can still participate and give something, even though you might be giving larger sums or different amounts as you prosper, or if you set it up and it's recurring. And we've had members here who set up a recurring payment and it comes in the mail as a form of a payment.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we've actually done an online payment
Mm-hmm.
process, but we could, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to match the practicality of doing it with the intent of Those are practical questions.
Right. I don't believe I've been asked that before. In fact, I don't really know that I've given it much thought, but I think certainly, I think it probably, well, it certainly seems, I agree with you, with what you've assessed from that. It seems to me that a good argument could be made that since the modifier there is that as you have prospered, well, if you haven't prospered in that week, if you didn't receive a check in that week, then how much have you prospered? And so, I don't know. I think that's matters like that. It's probably just left into the one that's actually doing the giving. But I agree with your assessment on it. Anyone else have any thoughts on that? Yes, sir, Barry? Well, the difference there is he's speaking about their righteousness, not necessarily, it's not specifically their monetary giving, but it would an application could be made. Yeah. 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 Well, perhaps, but the main thing is he's talking about their righteousness overall. That if we got into the specifics, I guess we could easily go further than what was intended. Well, they drove 5 miles to services, and well, they walked 5 miles to services, so unless we walk 6, you know. Any other questions or comments on that? Thank you. I appreciate that. I like the questions and comments. It certainly adds to our class. Verse 3, when I come, whosoever ye shall approve by your letters, them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. And so Paul doesn't propose to take charge of the contribution himself. I'm reading Kaufman's statement here because it's spot on. He says, Paul did not propose to take charge of the contributions himself, suggesting here that men duly appointed by the congregations should with the proper screening and recommendation be dispatched with the money to its destination. The care of the apostle to avoid all appearance of improper conduct in such a thing should be noted. He avoided all such suspicion of misappropriation of the funds. A list of the 7 faithful men appointed to carry the money is found in Acts chapter 20, along with a list of the various congregations they represented. And that's end of quote from Kaufman there. That verse in Acts chapter 20, verse 4, as I read it, I don't see any representation from Corinth. And so it might be the case that the Corinthians said, okay, well, we appreciate the sentiment, Paul, but it looks like the entourage that you have with you will be quite sufficient. We don't need to send anyone else. We trust you because here's the list. Acts chapter 20, verse 4, these are the people who were traveling with Paul on the way to deliver those funds to the needy saints at Jerusalem. And there accompanied him into Asia Sophater of Berea, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timotheus, and of Asia, Tychicus and Trophimus. And so there's the list. I don't see any listed, there's none listed there specifically from Corinth, nor from Achaia, which is the region that Corinth was in, nor of Greece, which is even a greater overall area. And so we can just guess as to why that might be the case. Knox writes in connection with this verse, one should remind himself of the danger involved in such a journey. They did not have cashier's checks and credit cards and money orders as we have in modern society. Thus, large sums of money, usually metals, had to be transported. Such things were hard to conceal and would make a tantalizing temptation for robbers. The danger was great, in transportation of such wealth as was probably taken to Jerusalem. So, just another reason why so many perhaps would have been needed. And then verse 4 to end this section here. And if it be meet or fitting, well, New King James says fitting, ESV advisable, other versions proper or appropriate. And so if it be appropriate, I'm going to use that word, if it be appropriate that I should go also, they shall go with me. And so Paul seems to be humbly submitting to the autonomy of the congregation there. He's humbly submitting to the will of the Corinthian congregation on the matter of delivery of the funds. He's saying, if you decide that in your view it's fitting that I should deliver the funds, then we can go together. You know, if you find it fitting that I should join them, he's not even suggesting that he's not even suggesting that he has to be with them. If you want them to go on their own, that's perfectly all right, in other words. But if you deem it necessary or fitting that I should go with them, well, we'll go together. That's what Paul says. Okay, that brings us to the end of this section about the contribution to the needy saints at Jerusalem. Any questions or comments before we move on? All right, let's look at verses 5 through 12, where Paul begins to wind down the epistle here. He lets them know of some of his personal plans. Let's read verse 5 and 6 together first. Now I will come unto you when I shall pass through Macedonia, for I do pass through Macedonia. And it may be that I will abide, yea, and winter with you, that you may bring me on my journey whithersoever I go. And so beginning in these verses, we have Paul's tentative plans to visit Corinth. And I say tentative because, well, for a few reasons. One, if you'll notice, you see the word may there. It may be, he says, I may, you may bring me with me. I may be that I abide with you. And then in verse 7, he says, if the Lord permit. You know, these things give us the idea that Paul is making tentative plans here. He understands that his plans might change. In fact, the Spirit might change his plans. Remember that happened on occasion? That the Spirit wouldn't allow him to go into a certain place at a certain time. The Macedonian call, and at one point the Spirit directed him, it is time to go into Macedonia. And then another reason I say this is tentative, because when we get to 2 Corinthians chapter 1, we will find that by the time Paul wrote that second epistle, his plans had changed. He had changed his itinerary, and then ultimately he even abandoned that one and went back to the previous itinerary. His tentative plans were to, as disclosed in this reading, his tentative plans were to stay there in Ephesus, from which he wrote this letter, until after Pentecost, and then travel by land north and west to Macedonia. And then when he got to Macedonia, he would turn southward and go to Corinth. And then he would likely stay with them there for the winter, as sea travel was completely stopped during the winter months because the seas were far too treacherous to travel on them. You remember that the captain of the ship, when Paul was on his way to Rome, the captain of the ship decided to push the issue a little bit into a little unsafe times, and they paid a price dearly for that. During the winter months, the shipping lanes were completely shut down, and then travel across land was even a lot more dangerous. And so his plan was that he would travel by land to Macedonia, and then southward down to Corinth, stay there with the winter, and then perhaps just like he did on his first journey, or on his second missionary journey, catch the ship there in Cenchrea, the port city for Corinth, and sail back to Syria, to the congregation from which he originally left, departed on his journeys. However, by the time you get to 2 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul explains to them then that there had been a delay in his plans due to some trouble at Ephesus. And we just simply need to read the account in Acts chapter 19, and we can learn all about the troubles, the sons of Sheba and Demetrius and the silversmiths, and all the things that happened to Paul the difficulties there. So he tells them his plans changed due to some trouble he ran into there at Ephesus, and he had thought about coming to them by sea. And departing, and so instead of going northward and over to Macedonia and then south to see them, he had thought about coming across the sea there and to the port of Cenchrea, and then leaving from there to Macedonia, and then coming back from Macedonia. And he says that would give them a second benefit. In other words, 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 15. In other words, they'd get to see him twice. But then ultimately he decided against that course of action because he wanted to give them time to get their house in order. In other words, he wanted to give them time to make the necessary corrections that this epistle demanded. And so Paul seems like he was a pretty wise man in every respect. Ultimately, we know what course he did take, because Luke tells us in Acts chapter 20, verse 1 through 3. Remember that when it comes to these discrepancies of dates and travel itineraries of Paul, the book of Acts is the gold standard, because the date of the book of Acts is later than the date of the epistles to the Corinthians. And so whatever Paul said he planned to do in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, what he actually did do is recorded by Luke in Acts. And so when we get to Acts chapter 20, verses 1 through 3, we find that what he did do actually was go to Macedonia, go south, and he did winter there in Greece, in which Corinth resides, for 3 months, at which point then he planned to go back to Syria, but the Jews were lying in wait for him again, and he had to go north to Philippi and then catch a boat. At any rate, this is a difficult section for some who are, it was difficult for me as I started to set out on this. I had to go back and read all these accounts. I had to read 2 Corinthians, I had to read this chapter, I had to read Acts, and put it all together because there were some discrepancies. But hopefully I've helped you to solve that a little easier. All right, verse number 7. For I will not see you now by the way, but I trust to tarry a while with you, if the Lord permit. And so Paul is basically saying, I don't want to just see you in passing. He wants to be able to spend a little more time with them. He needs to be able to spend a little more time with them to discuss all these matters that have been brought up, to teach them more on these issues. And he says, if the Lord permit. Paul reminds us that, again, this reminds us that Paul's plans were always tentative. His journeys were always subject to the will of the Lord, the guiding of the Spirit. At times it overruled his plans, but it didn't direct his every move. Paul did make plans. He made tentative plans, though. The Spirit didn't tell him every move to make, but it certainly overruled him on occasion. Paul was one who certainly applied that teaching of James, who said, Go to now, ye that say, today or tomorrow we will go into such a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get gain, whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time, and then quickly vanisheth, and then vanisheth away. For that you ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. And so we see Paul applying that by these words here. Verse 8 and 9, but I will tarry at Ephesus until Pentecost, for a great door and effectual is opened unto me, and there are many adversaries. And so Paul is planning to tarry, or that is to stay, in Ephesus until Pentecost. As we discussed in our introduction to this book, this is evidence that Paul was in Ephesus when he penned this epistle to the Corinthians. And even though the footnote in the King James and some other versions indicate that this book was written from Philippi, we got to keep in mind that those subscriptions were added later. They're not inspired. And in this case, it's certainly incorrect. Paul wrote this it couldn't have been written by the people, Secundus and others, that it talks about in the third person, and nor could it have been written from Philippi when Paul specifically says that he's in Ephesus when he's writing to them. And so I don't know what whoever wrote that subscription was thinking, but it's easy to see that it's inaccurate. Pentecost was one of the great national feast days of the Jews, and it correlates to May, June on our calendar, and so there's just a little bit of dating, a little help for the dating of this, at least what concerning Paul's plans. A great door, he says, and this is a door of opportunity, figure of speech, often used in Scripture. A door of opportunity, a great door. And so Paul sees a great opportunity if he stays in Ephesus. But he also sees many adversaries. To many, that would be a good reason to leave Ephesus, wouldn't it? But Paul was neither blind to the positive opportunities nor the negative adversaries, but he chose to face the threat of the adversaries in order to seize the opportunities. A great lesson for us as well. Where there are opportunities, there we can probably expect there to be adversaries because, well, the devil's not going to give in easy, is he? If we see adversaries, there's a good chance to interpret that as the gospel is working and the agents of darkness are redoubling their efforts to try to oppose it. Of course, again, we can read Luke's account in Acts chapter 19 and learn more about the details of those opportunities Paul speaks of and those adversaries that he faced. Verse 10 and 11. Now if Timotheus come, see that he may be with you without fear, for he worketh the work of the Lord, as I also do. Let no man therefore despise him, but conduct him forth in peace, that he may come unto me, for I look for him with the brethren. And so Paul had already told them that he had sent Timothy along with the reason for sending Timothy. That was in chapter 4, verse 17, where Paul said, for this cause I sent unto thee Timotheus, who is my beloved son and faithful in the Lord. For what purpose? Who shall bring you into remembrance of my ways, which be in Christ, as I teach everywhere in every church. And so Paul sent Timotheus just to help encourage and bolster them and remind them of the truth that Paul was teaching, not only to them, but everywhere that Paul went. The common salvation that Paul was teaching. See that he may be with you without fear. In other words, Paul didn't want them to take advantage of Timothy's youth, inexperience, and perhaps timidity. It is easy to foresee how the Corinthians might have taken any anger or frustration from that corrective letter out on Timothy. We know human nature. We know when someone gets corrected, they have an impulse, at least at the beginning, to lash out at someone over the correction, and it seems like Paul's anticipating the possibility of that, and so he's reminding them not to do that, not to take advantage of Timothy. Let no man despise him. Despise means treat with contempt or look down on. Don't look down on him. I would probably because of his youth, because of his inexperience. You know, Paul gave a similar instruction to Timothy, although it was years later. He said, 1 Timothy 4:12, let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example to the believers in word, in conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, and purity. I think there will always be a tendency to look down upon those who are viewed as young and inexperienced. But please notice Paul's basis, or the basis for Paul's requesting that Timothy should be treated well and shown respect. Not because Timothy had some high office or degree, not because he came from some notable family, not because he was a scholar, but because of the nature of the work he was doing. He was doing the work of the Lord. I think there's a lesson in that for all of us. Congregations all around the world have young men standing before them who presume to speak to people who are twice, 3 times their age, people who have a lot more experience in life, that is. And so from this, I'd say let the aged realize that a young man may not have the wisdom of experience, but if that young man is speaking the oracles of God, the Bible truth that is, well, he does have divine wisdom to offer, and he should be respected for that reason. And likewise to the young man who might feel timid and like he doesn't have anything. to offer these who have much more age and experience than him. Let him also keep in mind that as long as you stick with the oracles of God, you don't need to feel inadequate to speak to those who have more life experience, because you're imparting divine wisdom from above. A great lesson I think we can learn from this right here. He says, conduct him forth in peace. In the New American Standard translate this, send him on his way in peace. The New King James, send him on his journey in peace. And so Paul was expecting that Timothy would return to him in a timely manner. He's telling him, I'm going to be looking for him. Make sure that he gets back to me safely. And Timothy did return to him in short order, because by the time Paul wrote the second epistle to the Corinthians, notice how he started it, the very first verse, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother, into the church which is at Corinth, with all the saints which are at Achaia. And so despite Paul, whatever fears Paul might have of the Corinthian congregation mistreating or despising Timothy, and whatever fears he might have had, they were unrealized, because Timothy did come back to him safe and sound. With the brethren is most like a reference to those with whom Paul sent Timothy. Paul would not have sent Timothy by himself. Knox notes, it appears that everywhere brethren went on these missionary journeys, if possible, someone went with them. Even the Lord sent them out in pairs. Whenever possible, it would be wise for those doing the Lord's work to do so in pairs at least. Not only could they encourage and help one another, but they could also also offer a certain degree of protection for whatever enemy might oppose them. There's safety in numbers, either against a physical foe or one who is willing to twist the disciples' words. In the next verse, the same group of brethren is in view. As touching our brother Apollos, I greatly desired him coming to you with the brethren, but his will was not at all to come at this time. But he will come when he shall have a convenient time. Knox makes a great observation about this passage. I want to quote from Knox. He writes, this passage teaches something about the limitations of authority. Paul was an apostle, and by the thinking of most men, someone in authority has the right to command another. But Paul shows authority has limits in the Lord's church. Whether Apollos went or did not go to Corinth was not a matter of doctrine. He would not be sinning no matter which course he chose. Paul could urge him because he thought it was the best course of action to follow, but he had no right to command him to go or stay. Many elders or preachers would be wise to carefully consider this example of Paul's. I think that's a good observation, because I have heard, especially in some denominations, where religious authority figures whatever they say goes. And they expect everyone to just fall in line and just recognize their authority. And, well, that's not the mindset that Paul had. That's not what we see taking place in this case. When it comes to matter of doctrine, yes, but not in every case, as we see happening sometimes. All right, I think we'll conclude there. Any questions, comments about anything we discussed today? Yes, sir, Jeremy. I've heard people suggest that, but I'll be honest with you, I don't see anything in this at all to suggest that Apollos is angry. All I see is that suggested that he go, and for whatever reason, we don't know what the reason was. Apollos did not want to go at that time, but said he would go late. Maybe he already had other plans. Maybe he had already promised another congregation that he would be there to deal with something, and so he said, well, maybe he said, Paul, it sounds like a great plan, but I just can't do it right now, but I'll get to it when I can. You know, I don't see anything in the text to suggest it was anything more than that, although I have heard some commentators go down that line. Thank you. All right, we'll conclude here. We'll pick back up next week, verse 13, and we'll finish the book. Thank you.